Today's guest is Dr. Mark Schwartz, Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Davis Department of Environmental Science and Policy. And today we're here with Mark to discuss the California fires. As of now, we have, I believe, over 40,000 acres that have been burned. Over 27 people have died. Over 100,000 residents have been displaced, and over 12,000 structures have been destroyed. I've read some reports that place the damage at least at $275 billion, which would make it the costliest natural disaster in USA history, even surpassing that of Katrina in 2005. So, Dr. Schwartz, could these LA fires have been avoided, or at the very least, could they have been less severe? What do you think? And so, I mean, you live is it outside Sacramento? That's where UC Davis is, correct?
That's right. I live outside of Sacramento on the Central Valley in a relatively low fire risk part of the state. But yeah, no, the LA fires, the margins of LA and San Diego burn, and they're very flammable habitats. They're these shrub chaparral environments, and they have a natural fire return interval of 15 to 20 years. The problem with them is that when they burn hot and they burn quickly, and then they also recover quickly. And so the vegetation is ready to burn again in 10 years. And so they're very difficult ecosystems to manage for fire. Fire has always been part of the landscape there. There's some ecologists studying the ecosystems there have shown a variety of the native species that make up that ecosystem actually require heat for their seeds to germinate. So it's a fire-adapted ecosystem into which we've placed a lot of houses and increased the risk of wildfire quite substantially. So I don't think preventing fires generally in flammable landscapes with our natural ecosystems is an objective that we can actually get to. Minimizing the damage of fires and trying to control those fires is what we ought to be striving for.
You have something like over 200 published papers, don't you?
Something like that. A lot.
Right. Yeah, you have quite a bit. But in one of your papers, you basically say that politicians and journalists often blame forest mismanagement for the increasing size and intensity of wildfires in the Western U.S., but resource managers face significant challenges to implementing solutions. Harvesting trees is ecologically controversial and socially unpopular. Removing small, low-value trees requires subsidies. Biomass production remains economically unviable. Let burn policies carry risk, and prescribed fires face smoke-related regulatory hurdles. All active management strategies encounter economic, social, and regulatory barriers. And then I think in a different article, you're basically saying that and between 2005 and 2015, the state of California was responsible for an average of 82% of the annual total fire suppression costs. Yeah, most of those suppression costs are in Northern California versus Southern California because it's a completely different ecological system. You have forest, basically versus shrubland. But can you kind of like talk about? I mean, it seems like there's just a lot of like barriers and obstacles to trying to as you are, Department of Environmental Science and Policy, but it seems like there's a lot of barriers to getting these policies kind of more mainstream and more accepted.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there in what you just quoted. And so we'll go through that. It'll take some time to go through that. But one of the things to understand is that we really live in two different states with respect to fire in California. And that if you look at Northern California from the Redwoods over and down the Sierras, it's forested. It is more densely forested than it was historically. And that we've had less fire on the landscape than would be historically expected. So we have something called a fire return interval departure. In other words, how often we expect a fire to come through an ecosystem, and then how long has it been since a fire has come through that ecosystem. And there, the fire return interval departure suggests that we need to be having more fire on the landscape in order to keep a healthy ecosystem. But to do that, we have to get down to a lower tree density. And that is one of the challenges that we're facing, and one of the areas where California has been investing quite heavily. And that's been in response to some of the largest wildfires in the U.S. In the U.S. history, and we'll talk about that. But then the other part of the state is Southern California, and this is where you have this dry chaparral, where it's a very dry environment. It's effectively a desert in terms of annual precipitation, and you have ecosystems that burn very intensely and reasonably frequently, and we have massive urban areas that are butt up right next to it, and then we have this unfortunate climatic phenomena of Santa Ana winds, that there are high wind events in lots of different places in the world, but Southern California gets some real whoppers. And when you get a high wind event with an ignition, that fire can go out of control very, very quickly. And as a consequence, it's a different sort of fire management problem because there's not a lot of fuels treatment you can do to the ecosystems to reduce that fire risk. And so there's really two approaches to thinking about reducing fire risk across the state. One is where you can reduce fuels in those forests, and one where you can't really reduce those fuels. And so you really have to be thinking about those fires in different ways. And since we're all thinking about the Los Angeles fires because they just happened, we can go there first. We can talk about the forest issue in a little bit. But California has invested a lot of money into reducing fire risk. And part of the problem that you mentioned there that I've written about is that virtually all of the actions that we would take to reduce risk are socially unpopular. And so people don't want to do them. People move to national forests because they like trees. They don't want to see them all cut down. People like the chaparral and the hills next to their houses. People want to live up these canyons with natural vegetation. Who wouldn't? But they're putting themselves in a risky environment, and we have limited capacity to tell them they can't do that. So in Northern California with forest fuels, a lot of that management that we have to do has to do with cutting trees and reducing fuels. But in Southern California and the wildland-urban interface, it's really about people's homes because these fires move very quickly and they get into houses and they start burning houses. Now, just to give you, sort of a reference on this is that the Palisade fire started on the morning of January 7th. And within 48 hours, less than 48 hours, by the evening of January 8th, it was 75% as large as it ever got. And it probably burned up most of the houses that it was going to burn up by that point in time. So these fires, they're nearly 100-mile-an-hour winds. And they get going and they get going quickly. And when they're close to urban areas, they can move into those urban areas quickly. And then, within 48 hours, 72 hours, the expansion of that fire had slowed down a lot because vegetation burns a lot faster and moves a lot faster than burning houses. But it's almost impossible to stop fires from happening. Southern California is in drought conditions moderately frequently. The changing climates over the last couple of decades has made that more frequent and more intense. And as you get these dry falls, dry winters with those high wind events more frequently, it just is, frankly, it's sort of surprising that something like this hasn't happened already before this year, because it's just a situation that is ready to happen in many, many different places in Southern California. And so the leading strategy for reducing the potential for those fires to cause damage is home hardening, and home hardening costs homeowners a lot of money. And so it's not getting done at the rate at which we might expect it to.
I was reading this article today in kind of preparation for this from The Economist, and it basically says that strict regulations in LA require new homes to be fire resistant, but most homes are not new. NIMBYism and convoluted environmental rules make it extraordinarily difficult to build so much of the housing stock. It makes it extremely difficult to build. So much of the housing stock predates the modern building code and is packed with flammable wood. Dense urban development would be reasonably fireproof, and most of LA is zoned for single-family homes, which sprawl out into the foothills. nestling against flammable undergrowth. Clearing or thinning that flammable vegetation is hard since environmental objections can delay controlled burns for years. And then it basically goes on to say that a well-functioning insurance market would encourage sensible behavior by charging people more if they own fire-prone homes in fire-prone areas. But in order to make their homes safer, they basically can't, talking about how, insurance companies can't raise their premiums by X amount of dollars to kind of market correct. And as you mentioned, I think in a previous article, you basically said that, whereas California spends roughly $2.5 billion in firefighting each year. In addition, they also have another $364 million just in cutting fire breaks. Yeah. So, it doesn't, right now I saw reports where, a lot of people are kind of bashing the mayor of LA, Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom. But do these policies just go back decades that if you can't, raise the rates on homes, I had a professor from, I believe, Iowa talking about insurance when we were talking about the hurricanes in North Carolina. And he says that there's actually a lot of people that don't pay enough for homeowners insurance. And so it seems like there's kind of like a mismatch, but
yeah, it's a hard social problem. So there was a paper, and I've forgotten the author of it, but it was a post-mortem assessment of the Front Range fire in Colorado, where 3 different communities had instilled fire-safe building requirements for homes. And then a fire came through, damaged a lot of structures. And what did the politicians in those communities do? Well, faced with this a hard social issue where homeowners whose houses burned came to them and said they couldn't afford to rebuild with the fire safe codes because they were underinsured. In most homes in the U.S. are underinsured. And so in 2 out of 3, or maybe all 3 out of the 3 jurisdictions, the politicians backtracked and said, okay, well, then rebuild your homes how you can. And it's sort of the compassionate thing to do. And we want government to be compassionate, but it also creates a future problem. So these houses that were in a fire-prone area are going back in a fire-prone area in a fire-prone manner. And it's not helpful for society. Now, to give you some, an idea of how I see the magnitude of the problem in Southern California or in California, is if I just was out trying to do some back of the envelope calculations and thinking about how many homes are at the wildland urban interface, and estimates range between 1.5 and 2 million houses. And there's an organization in Montana called the Headlands Economics Institute, and they put out a publication on how much it costs to harden your home, your existing home. And they said the things that you can do for $2,000 to $3,000, and those are things like putting vents on your house that don't allow embers to come into the attic. But that if you really want to harden your home, it's going to require a fire retardant roof and fire retardant siding and some vegetation. And that's probably a minimum of $50,000. And so if you do the math on that, $50,000 times 2 million houses is $100 billion. $100 billion is, starts to look like the number of the damage that was caused by this fire. But when you think about what we're investing in fire safety, it's an order of magnitude higher. You mentioned that California had a budget of $2.5 billion that we had reported on that. That was 3 years ago now, and the budget this last year was 3.9, and the proposed budget for next year is 4.5. And so we're ramping up this budget. And the problem is that the challenge is that most of that budget is going to forest management. And so if you look at the older budget, 21-22, where the Legislative Analyst's Office broke out what that money was being spent on, something like 5% or 2% was being spent on home hardening, and the rest of it was being spent on things more to do with the Northern California forest problem. And partly there's some sense behind that, but this means that California is investing like $27 million on a $100 billion problem. Right? It's not going to get solved that way. And so how is it going to get solved? I mean, it's it's hard to imagine how we should solve it. Like, for example, I live in an area that isn't fire prone. So should my tax dollars go to pay for, say, your house who's up Hanga Canyon that needs a $50,000 retrofit? Well, I don't know. I would probably not want that so much. But it's, again, asking people to do that is very hard, that we don't have county and city regulations that are very good at forcing people to retrofit their houses. They bought those houses up those places for, the nice wood structures sitting in the natural vegetation that they are. And yet we're asking insurance companies to insure their potential losses. So it's a socially difficult problem to fix, and we have not come close to getting our mitts around it. And so instead of investing state tax dollars in doing a lot of home hardening or mandating home hardening, we're mandating new construction to be fire resistant. And time will tell whether, when people start building back around Malibu and Palisades, whether they're building with fire safe buildings, or if the politicians collapse back and allow people to build without those safety measures.
I mean, depending on the year, California is always fairly high up there for acreage lost to wildfires, but it's not like every year they're the leader. You have, some years it's New Mexico, you have Texas, you have Idaho, but I think in a lot of those states, they're just less populated, so you don't have the actual number of buildings or structures that are actually destroyed. Even Northern California, yeah, I guess with the exception, was it the 2018 Camp Fire, which, it was that like 13,000 structures and something like, was it like 60 or 70 people unfortunately died. But generally, like the fires in Southern California, they just end up destroying a lot of homes because it's densely populated. And I read that stat a little while ago, I'll read it again, but the state of California during 2005 to 2015 was responsible for 82% of annual total fire suppression costs. Well, why do you have to have 82%? Because you have a crap ton of people living in these areas. And like we were kind of talking about before, like a lot of these policies to actually harden these homes and to make changes so we don't have this happen again, they just, people don't want to do it, right? So, we can't be having $275 billion losses, reoccurring. People are already upset with the insurance companies in California, and that was before possibly the costliest natural event in the U.S. history. Yeah. Where does California, I guess in Southern California specifically, where do we go from here? This is unsustainable.
Yeah, it is unsustainable, and it's hard to know. Because it's pushing up against two really difficult social problems. California, the other problem, you could be talking about with some other guests who actually know something about this, is the housing crisis in California, and that people are really worried about affordable housing, and that we don't have enough homes in California, and we have to make more affordable homes. Well, making more homes and more affordable homes runs completely counter to this idea that we need to take homes out of the wildland fire urban interface and make them more fire resistant, which by default is making them more expensive homes. And so there's that social tension that we have to negotiate. And frankly, a home is mostly the homeowner's responsibility, and that we have laws that defend homeowners' rights to do what they want with homes. And so we can recommend that people retrofit their homes, but it's a very difficult thing to mandate. And so it gets mandated through the marketplace, which is the insurance industry. Insurance companies, refusing to insure in areas because it's too high a risk for them is what's happening. And as a consequence, then once again, it becomes a state problem. So in the state of California, we have a state program to provide home insurance to people who can't insure their homes through private insurance companies. And it's been growing massively because of the reticence of insurance companies to invest in insurance in California because of the risk. And so this is how I think it will play out. And I'm not sure exactly what it will mean, but in an ideal world, you could go house to house to house and say, well, your insurance is going to cost X because you've hardened your home, and yours is going to cost Y because you haven't. But fires don't exactly work that way, and that if you're a fire-hardened home, you're more likely to save your home in a wildfire, but you're more likely if all your neighbors are also hardened. And so there's a community safety and a community risk that insurance companies no doubt take into consideration as well when thinking about setting rates for homes. But it isn't a sustainable position. You're right, and we'll see how it goes in the future.
I had two guests talking about the hurricanes in North Carolina. One was a professor in San Diego who actually lost his home to the 2003 fire, and then I had another guest, Dr. Martin Grace, who's like risk insurance specialist at the University of Iowa, and they both basically said that after the hurricane, essentially the housing prices will go up. Like at first there'll be the kind of like the housing prices will initially kind of go down just because of, fear, panic, etc. But then eventually the housing supply is going to be significantly reduced. A lot of these houses will not be able to be rebuilt. You're seeing this in Asheville area right now. I have some friends that live there, and basically some of them aren't able to rebuild. FEMA will come in, say like, yeah, this is now, a floodplain. You're going to have to do all this extra stuff to your house if you want to have it put in there, which most people can't afford. So that just kind of goes back to, I guess you could say, nature. What's going to happen to, 12,000 structures plus right now? I think I read today 12,300, but I mean, are most of these not going to be able to be rebuilt? I was reading reports where some celebrities are like, yeah, I guess we're just going to move out and build someplace else. It seems like, I mean, is that?
Yeah. So I think there's two things going on there. And that is one that, humans have a remarkable capacity to forget. And so a disaster comes through and there's a lot of concern about it immediately. But through time, that concern drops off. Policy people think about this as a policy window that like right now is an opportunity to pass some kind of rules that would make it be game changing for building homes in Southern California, for example. But in 2 years, it probably won't be that. And this was hit home to me when we had this strange flood event probably 25 years ago here in the Central Valley that flooded the towns of Marysville and up the valley a bit. And what happened was an extremely warm rain came in on top of an early season snow. So it was right around Christmas. And that rain stripped all the snow off the mountains, off the Sierras. So a massive amount of water was coming down, and it almost overtapped the Oroville Dam. They opened it up as much as they possibly could and flooded the town of Marysville. And because of the nature of how long it takes for that water to get downhill and opening the gates up, they were actually flooding Marysville, and it was perfectly sunny out. Either way, it was not raining, right? And so everyone thought, well, the crisis has passed. Well, it immediately ended up with a moratorium on building in floodplains. And that moratorium lasted about 2 years. And then they went back to building in the floodplain along the Sacramento River down through Sacramento. So there's just this narrow window of time when people pay attention to it, and then it goes off the back of their minds. And I'm sure that's going to happen here as well. Is that right now we're going to be thinking about wildfire risk and where we shouldn't be building homes. And 18 months from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, the issue that's going to be on the front of our minds is going to be the housing crisis and not the wildfire risk. And so we have an opportunity to, I think, put in some policies about building homes in these environments. I didn't have a chance to look it up, and I'm really sorry I didn't. But an article was written called "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn." And it was written in 1989, and it was, and the idea, and it just went through the story of Malibu, how it was a ranch, and then how people wanted to move there, and it was this beautiful place, but that fires keep happening in the foothills above Malibu. And when you get these Santa Ana winds, they always rush down and out for the coast. We've probably all seen these images of smoke from these big Southern California fires where there's an enormous smoke plume heading out over to the Pacific. That's because those winds are heading outward, out to sea. And so any fire that starts up the canyon above Malibu is rushing right down into town. And so it's burned several times. And this person's argument is it's a place we just shouldn't be building houses. And the same is true of Palisades in terms of fire risk. And so what happens is yet to be seen. But there's a lot of people's money tied up in real estate there. It's hard to imagine a government that's going to say, no, you can't rebuild there. And so I suspect we will be rebuilding there. I just hope that we rebuild in a fire-safe manner, because fires will happen again, and they will end up down on that boundary into the houses. And once the Cal Fire got a sufficient number of engines, helicopters, and crews onto the landscape, they shut that fire down pretty quickly, pretty remarkably. I mean, I was just looking through the status reports of these fires, and in that first 12 hours, they had maybe 100 engines and 4 helicopters up in the air. And by the time, those fire resources are distributed all over the state. Firefighters from Canada and Mexico came to the fire. As of yesterday, they had 5,000 people and 500 engines and 40 helicopters mopping up the end of that. And so there's a transition from like no resources being on a fire that's moving at a jogging pace through the vegetation and into homes, to being a well-resourced and well-managed process of shutting that fire down, and that'll happen again someday. And so if those homes are hardened on that wildland-urban interface, it gives the firefighters a much better chance of shutting it down before it gets into very many homes.
You're talking about the housing pricing in LA already kind of being astronomical. I mean, there's no way they're going to rebuild all 12,000 of these structures. And even if they do, it's going to take decades. When I mentioned that, one of the podcasts I did with the professor that lost his home in San Diego in the 2003 fires, 2004, whatever, I think there's like 1,200 homes were lost. And he says, I mean, even today, over 2 decades later, they haven't even built 1,000. It took years, even for and you had was it like Bill Maher? I think I saw on his show that he was talking about how like it took 4 years just to get like solar panels installed. And that's something that like California wants you to do too. They want you to install solar panels. And he had like a clock, whatever. I think the exact, was it like, I forget the exact, but it was like 1,300 days. Yeah, it was 1,131 days. But anyways, I heard Gavin Newsom saying they're going to cut some of this red tape. If they don't get these like 12,000 structures built, the housing prices is already sky high. It's just going to go astronomical at that point, right?
Yeah, it's not going to be a comfortable situation. And I don't know how, right. So it's a complicated mess of many factors, in that as a homeowner, if you've lost your home in this disaster, you have a choice to make of whether you're going to try and rebuild or not try and rebuild. And I know some folks from Palisades, the campfire up there, it took them years for them to sort of process the disaster and the emotional grief of it all to even decide whether they were going to try and rebuild the house there. And you look at Paradise now, several years later, it's not fully rebuilt, not even close, and it's not clear that it will be ever again. It'll never look like it did. And some people have moved back and rebuilt, and others have said that they can't put themselves in that environment anymore. And then what do they do with the lot that they have? And so I suspect, these things are really traumatic events for communities.
You're now a professor emeritus at the University of California, Davis's School Department of Environmental Science and Policy. I mean, have you been like a consultant for other municipalities or for certain projects for people done, or, for them asking you, like, how can we keep our area from being destroyed by fires? Do you ever have any of those interactions?
Yeah, no, that's not me. I got into thinking about this problem in a sort of funny way. I started out as a plant ecologist, a vegetation ecologist, and thinking about how we manage wildfire and sort of the social problems we have with managing fires in the other part of California, Northern California, where we have all these fuels that we want to try and adjust so that we have more fire resilient ecosystems, and the social barriers to actually getting that work done, or the logistical barriers of getting that work done. But I've also invested a lot of my time and energy into thinking about green spaces and conservation, and how much of that is important to urban areas. And so I started working with some colleagues who we're also ecologists, but also spending a lot more time thinking about the insurance industry and what they do with and their risk portfolios with homes in the wildland-urban interface. And that's how I kind of got into that area. But yeah, most of my work and working with applications of this has been with resource management agencies and thinking about how they distribute resources. So one of the fires that we had here in Northern California is called the Calder Fire, and it burned up a town called Grizzly Flats. And one of the controversy that emerged from that fire was that the Forest Service had recognized a high fire risk to the town probably 25 years ago and had started working on a plan to make the town more fire safe. And they never got the plan finished. And so then the Calder Fire came and the town burned up. And people were mad. And so so there was a public radio story on it about how the federal government let the town of Grizzly Flats down by not ever finishing the plan. Well, you start thinking about that. You think, well, how did the federal government not live up to the commitment to that community and make it more fire safe? And who is really to blame in this situation? Because it's very easy to blame government. It's easy to point fingers at government and say it didn't get the job done. And they didn't get the job done. But why didn't they get the job done? And part of that is that the Forest Service has a really anemic budget. It has very little money to do forest management. And then there are social forces that work against thinning timber. They had a plan to thin timber on a couple of slopes that were where they thought they were particularly fire vulnerable, and they were sued and stopped, and they spent years in court trying to argue that this is a plan that should be done, because there was a group that kept suing them over the plan. And so it took them many years to get the plan written. It took them many more years to get the plan out of courts, and then it was moving very slowly because of these anemic budgets. And so, yes, there is a failure of government in getting the work done, but it may be we ought to be looking at ourselves a little bit more in our roles in that we have demanded since the 1970s that the Forest Service take an easier stance on the environment and cut fewer trees and reduce environmental damage to ecosystems. And the consequence of that has been more trees. And we've taken this stance that we have a right as people to challenge the decisions that the Forest Service makes. And so we spend a lot of time in court doing this, and that also slows the process down. And at some level, we are getting the government we ask for in terms of the budgets we have for public agencies, and that budget isn't sufficient to do the job we're asking them to do. And so it's a failure of government, but it's hard to point a finger at somebody who works for the Forest Service and say, this is your fault. It's much easier it's much more logical to say, we as a society have failed to empower the government to do the job that we're expecting them to do.
Talking about kind of government or people blaming the finger at government, anytime you have a situation like this, people want to point the blame. They want to point the finger. They don't want to point it at themselves, right? We've heard about how California or LA didn't have enough, the fire hydrants weren't working, or fire hydrants were empty. They had a reservoir that was empty. They didn't have enough water pressure.
Yeah.
People are saying that, the mayor was out of town. She was in Africa, I think, meeting with another president. There's so many different, finger pointing going on. Do you think a lot of that stuff's kind of been over-reported, or, should that reservoir have been full? As someone that doesn't really know this, just hearing what the news is saying, is that a big deal, little deal?
Yeah, we don't manage reservoirs for the event that they need to be used to pull water out and fight fires. We manage them for other purposes, and so there are lots of reservoirs that get drawn down at various points of time for reasons, that they're maintaining the reservoir, or they're using it during this season to provide urban water. I don't know why this one didn't have water in it, and I don't know whether that was a good decision or a bad decision. But of course, if you see it that it's empty, someone's going to point the finger and blame somebody. Now, the fire hydrants and the water pressure, that is really an interesting problem that I've never heard of a fire that resulted in that problem cropping up. But you can sort of think through it logically and think, oh yeah, well, of course, that if you have a fire that's coming into an urban area, what does everybody do? They turn all the water on in their yards, start sprinkling everything as they try and get out of Dodge. And so there's a big concern over flood risk in lots of communities all over the country. But one of the things that several cities in California have done over the last 10 years has been something called this arc storm planning process, where they say, if we get a 100-year storm in, say, Sacramento, how much water would that put into Sacramento? Do we have routes that people can get out, emergency vehicles can get in? Which hospitals are on virtual islands and which ones are not? So basically planning for this idea that you have this flood disaster. And communities think that this has been a successful and helpful process. And I don't think we've done this for wildfire. And it probably, then I think the water situation in the Palisade fire is probably pointing a light on this, and maybe we'll start doing this, is thinking about how is this engineered? I mean, could we engineer these fire hydrants to actually have had enough water pressure? All the wildland fires that we fight without fire hydrants. So the fighting a fire without a fire hydrant is not a foreign thing, but house fires we fight with fire hydrants. And so these were a lot of house fires. And so I think there'll probably be a lot of thinking about, is there a re-engineering that is possible, or a re-engineering that can be done or not? And are there policy decisions about water storage that need to be made differently as in thinking about wildfire risk? Because, every year from, late October through now, this is pretty late for this. We get these Santa Ana winds, these big wind events down in Southern California. And it's the time we're shouldering from the dry season into the wet season. And so the overlap of a dry season with high wind is not an unlikely occurrence. And it's what fueled the Camp Fire up in Northern California. And it fired it drove all of these big damaging fires that we've had.
One of the papers I was reading, you say that average annual area burned during this period is still well below estimates of annual burning before colonial settlement. And I believe in this paper, the time period was like 1980 to 2020. Is that, if I remember correctly? So, and I did a podcast yesterday. I haven't published it yet, just because I did it yesterday with John Keeley, who's also like a pretty big fire expert. And I mean, he was basically saying, like, plants and a lot of nature evolved with fire. And of course, like the big question is, the frequency, the intensity, the duration. Those are obviously, like, those things could be manipulated, and that could be either good or bad depending on the intensity, duration, etc. And so, I mean, California is, in all the papers that I read, I mean, I was reading papers going back to like the 1930s saying Southern California was the most fire prone area in the world. And then this area, and like John Keeley basically says, like, the reason these fires are like more costly every year is because there's just more population, right? Like, you're in a fire prone area, you put more people in there. I watched a talk with him where he had a map on like a 1967 fire, and like 29 buildings were destroyed. And then years later, thousands of buildings. It's basically the exact same fire, but of course you just had more people or buildings living in that area. And so Southern California, I mean, doesn't the state of California average like 7,000 wildfires a year? The vast majority of them don't really do a whole lot of damage. But when you have a wildfire in the Southern California area, like you're talking about, you don't have trees, you have these shrubs, you have the Santa Ana winds. All it takes is just to, a certain condition. He was saying, 99% of the fires in Southern California are human caused. I believe the biggest cause was power lines. While the more people you add in, the more infrastructure you add into power lines, so then you increase that risk. And so it just seems like in this Southern California area that we're just going to have, like, I mean, if no one's willing to, I mean, no one wants it's the whole NIMBYism, right? I mean, people want other people to make the sacrifice. They themselves don't want to make the sacrifice. But if you have 30 million people that have the same attitude, nothing's ever going to change.
Right.
I mean, like it just, I guess the question is like, this fire is still ongoing. I think I saw it today. Like, was it like San Diego County, was having to do some evacuations, but once this whole thing's over, what are the lessons from this? And like you said earlier, 18 months to 2 years later, people kind of forget. I mean, it's nothing. Are we in 10 years from now, are we going to be on the same podcast talking about the exact same thing? I mean, I hope not, but it just doesn't seem like, history repeats itself, or as Mark Twain said, it doesn't history just rhyme, whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's again a lot to unpack there, because I think that, John said that, or somebody said that Southern California is the most fire-prone place in the world. Well, I think Australians would probably argue with them on that one, but there are other places. There are plenty of places that are very, very fire-prone, but they're kind of this characteristic landscapes where you have these Mediterranean climates where you get, the precipitation is very seasonal, so you go into very dry periods of time, and you have and they're warm, and you're right. Lightning is a very unusual thing down in Southern California, and as a consequence, most of the fires that are in those areas are human set, either by power lines, negligence, or arson. And so those are what causes most of this damage. And there's some things that you can do to start to prevent those, like burying power lines. It makes the power lines a lot safer. Then we're starting to do that, but that's a very, very costly thing. And people are already really angry about utility costs in California because of the settlement payments that the power companies have had, and the rate, how that's affected rates. But there are some bright spots on this. John was probably he, by the way, was the one personally responsible for doing a lot of this research on seed germination in chaparral after fire. That was part of his research area. But if you look at, with CAL FIRE publishes the 20 largest and the 20 most destructive and the 20 deadliest fires, and 9 of the 9 biggest fires in California history have happened since 2017. So they were getting lots of really massive fires. And some of our most destructive fires have been recent. But if you look at the deadliest fires, about half of them are before the 20th century. 7 of them are before 1968. We are able to have an increased fire frequency, intensity, and size, and yet not scaling up with how deadly those things are, how much they're killing people. We're very good at keeping people safe in these wildfire events, which I think is a bit of good news, given that this is such a severe issue. Damaging fires, a lot of those are in Southern California. And a lot of those fires are in Southern California, and they will probably remain in Southern California and in the Bay Area, the Coast Range. There we have lots of vulnerabilities in the San Francisco Bay Area as well. But where were we on that? You went on with you brought up a few things. One was the vegetation and the flammability of it. One was the climate change and warming. On that front, I think our droughts in California, it's not just getting warmer in California or around the planet, really, but it's also that our drought periodicity is getting steeper. And so we get these patterns set up that will make either California very wet one year and very, very dry the next. And so we should be expecting more long dry periods. And that's probably increases the risk factor more than the warmth does, and because it extends the opportunity for fire over longer periods of time. And people say that, well, fighting fires in California used to be a seasonal thing. Now it's just 12 months a year that we're vulnerable. And that's been a problem.
I guess, one of the other points I was making was just these LA fires, San Diego, whatever, in Southern California is just very populated, heavily populated. You're talking about Australia. I lived in Australia. I did a work and holiday visa for there in Australia for like a year. And, like 80% or whatever, 90% of the population lives in 2 cities. They're in
Sydney, Melbourne, yeah.
Yeah, Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, I was over in Darwin for part of it, and like, I mean, you think you're in a different country. I was in Perth, Gold Coast, like,
Place, though, isn't it?
yeah, it's super cool. But like, when places are burning there, like most of it's in the outback, or quote unquote the outback. No one lives there. So like, the real issue, and when you're talking about Southern California, is just such a heavily populated area. And like, one of my favorite books is Cadillac Desert, and I mean, he's talking about the water and how it gets basically from the Rockies and from the Cascades and whatnot to California. And fascinating book. I mean, it's probably a little bit dated now, probably it's from the 80s, but I mean, talk about a boring topic, and the guy turns it into like one of the most interesting books you've ever read. But his kind of overall premise, though, is California, especially LA area, is just such an artificial condition. And like, I mean, a lot of this water was kind of brought into California in the first place was because of the whole gold rush. There's so much, but it's just like such artificial conditions, like and like we've kind of talked before. I mean, I think maybe one of the biggest issues is just in changing policy on insurance. Like if you had to pay $15,000 a year to be in a fire prone area, or you're paying a normal rate to be in a non-fire prone area, maybe you would decide, hey, I'm going to live here. And the people that either choose to afford it or can't afford it. And then, of course, like you mentioned before, though, then you're going to get into kind of social issues of like, oh, why can these people be here? And, like just because they got cash, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like nothing's free. Like if something's free, someone else is paying for it.
Right.
And I mean, I feel like maybe this is one of those moments where maybe California, particularly LA, is going to have to come to terms with some of these policies.
Yeah. And the challenge is that, we have governments that are set up to compartmentalize responsibilities, things that aren't in the Constitution aren't supposed to be the federal government's responsibility. They're supposed to be state responsibilities, and states have constitutions and constraints, and what isn't their responsibility goes down to cities and counties. And so, really our zoning laws are county laws and city laws. And so whether cities and counties get to say whether you can rebuild here or rebuild there. And so it's not usually the purview of the state. And so, and that creates a problem because you get different communities that can be making different decisions. And that when you have the state come in and say, oh, no, we're going to take control of this. Like California has a coastal zoning commission. And it was because the state of California felt that if we didn't have something statewide that would sort of constrain development along the coast, that we would have a metropolitan area that ran all the way up the coast, and this beautiful California coastline that people think of along Big Sur just wouldn't exist. And so we have this thing. And it's a controversial thing that is this state meddling into local politics, that the counties and cities really have jurisdiction over that. And it is an unusual thing. Not many states have anything like this. And so will California decide that it needs to do this again and reach into the hip pockets of these counties and cities and say, we're going to constrain what you can and can't allow in terms of building because of this statewide interest in making a fire safe environment for as many people as possible? I don't know. It'll be a hard thing to do. I think if you tried to run as a governor by saying you're going to make California fire safe, I think you could probably achieve the fewest votes of any gubernatorial candidate ever, because you'll end up putting yourself in a lot of politically unpopular positions. And yet this is the work the state has to do. California
Coastal Commission, I think that came under a little bit more publicity when they blocked Elon Musk and some extra rocket launches, and several of the women on that board basically cited his, political beliefs. And I think I saw some stuff. That's actually the first time I ever heard of the California Coastal Commission. But
it was the 1970s, 80s. I don't remember the origin of it. It's a much maligned institution in that it prevents a lot of things from happening. But on the other hand, California is an absolutely gorgeous coastline, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Coastal Commission has set limits on what can be built and then how you build things there.
This is like 10 years ago now, but I hiked the Lost Coast, which I believe it was at like a 52-mile trail, and
Yeah.
untouched. I mean, well, untouched except by feet, but there's no like buildings or structures. It's pretty cool.
Amazing landscape. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of last big question before we get you out of here, which is just as someone that's an expert in this, Dr. Mark Schwartz, Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Davis Department of Environmental Science and Policy, is someone that's studied this for decades. If you were, say, governor or, some type of high, political position in California, at least for a day, that way you didn't have to take the heat of these, policies. But what would you kind of implement or at least recommend implementing? Yeah.
Well, I will say that the most hopeful outcomes that I have seen over the last 10 years in terms of reducing wildfire risk have been in the form of federal and state grants to communities for communities to make the whole community more fire safe. And so we have a lot of foothill communities. They're mostly foothill communities in Northern California, but the Camp Fire that wiped out Paradise was a big wake-up call for those foothill communities around 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet. There's a lot of them. And they started saying, we need to make our community more fire safe. And that can be things like home hardening in the community, but it can also be thinking about vegetation management around the margin of the community to try and help the fire not get into the community. And because I think it's hard for governments to say, I'm going to give you and you and you these grants to harden your homes, but we don't have enough money to give you grants. So I think that giving money to individuals is a difficult thing and not really where the state's going to go. But communities are, and I think that events like this open up the door for other frontline suburbs around our metropolitan areas in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. To say, yeah, we want to make our community more safe, and we can do that through several measures of managing that wildland-urban interface through vegetation, but also zoning and what they do as they expand. And so I think that's our near-term best opportunity to make this situation better is by better funding communities to make their own communities more fire safe.
Talking about like home hardening and talking about John Keeley in one of his presentations, he was talking about, they went back and kind of researched some fires where a lot of homes were destroyed and what were some of the commonalities. And he said the biggest commonality was just kind of branches that were overhanging the roof. And he wasn't saying that like it fell on it and burned it, but basically the embers would come and kind of, maybe there's a bunch of leaves on the roof and then or it gets into the attic, etc. Yeah. And so maybe it's trimming those branches, going onto the roof, getting the leaves out of the gutters, things like that. Pretty simple things.
Yeah,
and it seems like
that's creating fire safe space in front of your house, and that's really important. And so a community can do that as well, creating a safe space in front of around the margin of the community. And both those things are very important. One of the problems, and you can imagine when a fire is moving like a front along through vegetation, that's really important. One of the risks, of course, is in these really high wind events is these embers can blow hundreds of meters. And so you can get a spot that will be way out in front of a fire. And so those embers getting into something flammable is a problem. And leaves and gutters, really good things that can start on fire with with an ember. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that individuals can do to increase their safety.
Right, and those things aren't really that expensive to do either that we just mentioned, right? No. So take a little bit of time on your weekend, but
it does take a community because I have leaves that pile up in my gutter and they can be cleaned out every 6 months, and I do them every 2 years.
Right.
It's you got to get up there and do it, and so it's. But yes, you can also put those little vent things over the top of your gutters so leaves don't get in the gutters, and so there's lots of, and they aren't very expensive. So there are little things that you can do that help a lot. Yeah.
So Dr. Mark Schwartz, just thank you so much for joining us today. I was asked kind of my guest final question, which is just leave us with a final thought, whether it's related to this podcast, something that you're working on, something we didn't discuss that we should have discussed, or whatever is on your mind.
Well, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, no, I think actually my final thought was that one I just gave about better empowering communities to make make their communities safe, and because I think there's a lot. We like our communities generally. We move there because we like them, and we're much more prone to listen to our neighbors than listen to somebody in Washington, D.C. or in Sacramento telling you what you ought to do. And I think there's a real power when communities take on the task of making their environment more fire safe, and people start getting on board and saying, well, what are you doing over there? Well, I'm doing this, this, and this to improve my fire safety. I'm moving my vegetation back. I'm cleaning my gutters out. I'm putting these vents on my house, and I'm thinking about putting a metal roof on next year. That I think has real positive effects, and people start to come along with the program to increase fire safety.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.